Biotech, what is it and why should you care? How should the US prepare for the coming age of biology? Does biotech really matter for national security? What are China's biotech ambitions and what implications, if any, should they have for US policy? For the 101 and 102 on biotech, tall order, you two, we have on today the chair and vice chair of the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology. Jason Kelly is the co-founder and CEO of Ginkgo Bioworks, a publicly traded firm that provides a horizontal platform for cell programming, and Michelle Rozo, currently vice president of technical capabilities at In-Q-Tel, who previously served in Biden's NSC, R&E in the Pentagon, and on the Hill. Co-hosting today, noted biotech expert Chris Miller. Great to have everyone on the show.
CRISPR.
That was a particularly bad one.
CRISPR Miller. So Jason, what is biotechnology?
DNA is code, right? You know, it's ATCs and Gs, not zeros and ones like in a computer. But I swear, inside a bacterial cell is 3 million letters, ATCs and Gs, in a line. And that cell reads that code and does all the things that a bacteria does. It grows, it eats things, it produces stuff. You know, your human genome, 3 billion letters long. Plant genomes, actually bigger than human genomes, 5 billion, 10 billion letters long in some cases. That is the programming code that defines what the organism is made out of, right? How it builds itself and all the things it does. Okay. And we've learned over the years the power of being able to have a programmable substrate in the form of computers, right? Because you put different code into this machine and then magically the next day it does something it couldn't do before, right? You download an app to your phone and suddenly it can call you a cab and show up right at your feet where the week before it couldn't do that. Okay. And that's what biotechnology is. It's designing new code to put inside of cells. And the next day, they do something they couldn't the day before, right? It is to be able to program them because DNA is fundamentally code.
Fantastic, Jason. So how has that insight, played out? You want to start the clock at Watson and Crick? You want to start it at 1976? You take us through the 20th century of biotechnology.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So one of the things that is exciting is mid-century, we even figured out that DNA was the code, right? You know, right? Like just to tell you how fast all this has happened. Right? Like we didn't know what the material was inside cells that passed heredity, right? That passed information generation to generation. And when we figured that out in the 50s with DNA, we figured out all the coding of that and how you turn into proteins and things like that. So, but when it comes to biotechnology, again, I would highlight what's special about biotechnology is it's not really about understanding how biology works. That's biology. You know, lots of biological scientists doing that every day of the week. And by the way, they're hugely important to biotech because we need to know how these things work. But biotech is about programming the cell, putting in new DNA code to make it do a new thing. And that started basically in the late 70s with the invention of what was called recombinant DNA. All right. And you mentioned Genentech. This was the first biotech company that started in South San Francisco. But let me tell you the technologies that made that possible. There were 3. Okay. The first, what was called polymerase chain reaction, PCR. You might have heard of that. And what PCR does is it lets you take a fragment take a genome, like, a human genome or whatever, have a certain portion of it that you amplify, that you make a lot of copies of. And the reason you need that is if you want to work with DNA in the lab, you need a lot of copies. Having one little molecule of DNA, like you would have inside a cell, is not enough to work with. You need millions of copies. So PCR does this little thing where it amplifies DNA. Second tool, recombinant DNA, restriction enzymes. All right. And you've heard of CRISPR recently. People have heard about CRISPR, Nobel Prize and all that stuff. CRISPR is the latest version of this, but the version back in 1976 were what were called restriction enzymes. And what they would do is they were little molecular scissors. They would cut DNA at a certain location. So it is molecular scissors to be able to cut the DNA. That's restriction enzymes. Okay. And then the third technology was actually an understanding about how biology worked. It was a thing called the operon. And it was basically, and this is like Mark Patashni's group at Harvard and others, it was how do you turn a gene on and off inside a bacterial cell? What's the on switch? Okay. And here's what Genentech did to begin the biotech industry. They said, diabetics, and my dad's actually a type 1 diabetic, can't make human insulin. All right. Like kids who have juvenile diabetes. And so what were we doing pre-1976? We would get insulin from pigs. Okay. Porcine insulin. And these kids would take it as shots. All right. It wasn't great. And you had all these allergic reactions and things like that. Boy, if they could just get human insulin, how could we make it? Well, we could take polymerase chain reaction to amplify copies of the human insulin gene from a human genome in the lab. So now you've got a tube and it's got all these human insulin gene in it. Then you're going to take restriction enzymes and cut the ends of those pieces of DNA so they have little sticky bits hanging off them that we know the sequence. Then using our knowledge of the operon, like how a bacteria turns a gene on and off, we're going to make a cut right downstream of an on switch inside of a bacterial cell. And what are we going to paste in? Those human insulin genes that we got copies of in the lab. We're going to just paste them in right behind that on switch in the bacteria. And then in a tank in South San Francisco, we're going to grow vats of these bacteria. And guess what they're going to make? Human insulin. Because now they've been reprogrammed. We just installed that app in. We plugged in the human insulin gene right behind the on switch, and it just cranks insulin. And that was your first biotech product. It was a reprogrammed E. coli bacteria to make the human insulin gene to give to juvenile diabetics, give to kids that needed insulin. And that was the birth of the biotechnology industry. But those were the underlying technologies that made it possible. PCR, restriction enzymes, and the operon, knowledge about biology.
You want to give the how government helped make Genentech possible spiel?
Herbert Boyer and Stanley Cohen were two professors that were studying these restriction enzymes and invented this process of cloning. And that was absolutely government-funded work going on to create that initial breakthrough. PCR was done in an industrial lab by this guy, Kerry Mullins, or this kind of a weird guy. And then the and this is an important point about the understanding of the biology. That was also funded research, basic research about learning about how bacteria turn genes on and off for no reason other than understanding the bacteria. Right. Yeah. And this is one of the things that people don't really get. Like, this is where biology is different than computers. The biggest difference between computers and biology, they're both programmable. I swear to God, you put code in, they do things. Humans invented computers. We did not invent biology. So in order for us to program these biological computers, these cells that are incredibly powerful, first we have to understand them. And that's what the basic research of biology goes out and does. And we can talk about this when it comes to AI models that are really leading in this and the data generation. I think it's very important with regard to how we compete with China and others on creating these data assets. But that like basic biology research, absolutely driven by the U.S. government. It's in fact, it's the only source of funding.
So we have Genentech, we're making insulin. What else happens over the subsequent decades to expand the applications and market size of what biotech can bring?
So you have a whole bunch of companies start to copy Genentech, right? You know, so you had your Biogens and your Genzyme, all these other companies that are starting to make all these human proteins as drugs. That starts to happen. But then you have a company out in St. Louis, Missouri, who is working on the problem of how do I deliver DNA and these same kind of, in this case, restriction enzymes don't really work. How do I deliver DNA into a plant? Okay. And that company is called Monsanto. And so in the 90s, what you have is the birth of plant biotechnology. And you have the fastest adopted technological innovation in the history of agriculture, which was GM crops for corn and soybeans in the United States. You also have the banning of that in Europe, interestingly, which is a whole discussion if we want to talk about how these technologies expand and contract and so on and who leads. That was in the 90s, the low level technology got invented to deliver DNA into a plant cell. Okay. And what's interesting about it is it wasn't as good as being able to put DNA into the bacterial cell like we were able to do in pharma, until CRISPR came along recently. We haven't had the same ability to put the DNA exactly where we wanted it. But Monsanto did figure out how to get DNA in, and you had the birth of agricultural biotechnology in the 90s. Does that make sense on that? And thus, the two big markets of biotech were born: pharmaceuticals and then in the 2000s, you had a big push in what's called genomics. And genomics is the reading of DNA code. Okay. And so you can take a cell, grind it up, put it into a machine about the size of a washing machine, and you can read out the DNA code of whatever cell you put in there now. And this really took off in the 2000s because you might remember there's actually a public-private effort, but you had Bill Clinton up on stage with Francis Collins from the National Institutes of Health and Craig Venter from a company called Celera, announcing the sequencing of the human genome. And that U.S. effort that sort of spurred a private effort and a big race begat the genomics industry. And today, a company called Illumina in San Diego is sort of the undisputed leader there. And it's really, again, I would say, as a result of the U.S. government committing to the Human Genome Project in the late 90s that we need there.
So what is genomics, and what what does it do for people?
So again, remember, DNA is code, right? And so when you look out in nature, you see all of these plants and animals and you can't see the microbes, you see fish and birds. Inside the cells of every one of those organisms is like an operating system defined in code. All right. And if you want to be a biotechnologist, if you want to be a designer of DNA, those are the code libraries. Like, that's all the code that nature has been testing through the process of evolution over the last 4 billion years to find stuff that works. Right. Like, and again, let me I know there's like a lot of technologists and electronics and software people on this call. So let me just put your technology glasses on and look at a seed. Okay. You plant a seed in the soil, you add air, water, and sunlight, and you're not going to believe this, but something starts to just self-assemble out of the ground. No manufacturing facility. No, it is built. It starts to build solar panels. Okay. We call them leaves. It builds these solar panels to start harvesting sunlight energy to then continue its further manufacturing. Where is it getting the building blocks? From CO2. It is pulling atmospheric CO2 out of the air to manufacture it itself. And then once it's built enough infrastructure, now it starts producing products. Corn, fruit, whatever we might call it, food. Okay. It just starts making things and has this unbelievable self-assembling manufacturing technology. What kind of alien, like, if we didn't have seeds and I walked in with one, like, you'd be like Steve Jobs cubed, right? Like, what is this thing that's been invented? It's crazy, right? And so it's worth remembering that, like that type of technology, self-assembly, solar panels and leaves, very cheap, self-repair, right? Like, you cut your skin, it fixes itself. What do we have other materials like that? Right? Like, all these things are just magical powers. And inside of those cells is the code that defines the molecular machines that do that. So what is genomics? It's the technology to go read all those code books, right? It is what is letting us see how nature does all this stuff, so that as biotechnologists, we could then repurpose it where we want. Oh, well, now I want to have self-healing clothing or self-repairing roads or whatever. I want to bring a technology I know biology can do to a place that's important to humans. Okay. And so that's why genomics is so important, because it's like our chance to go out and like get those codes.
We take an analogy of the ocean, and every drop of water in the ocean as potential for sequencing. We've sequenced one drop of like the entire ocean as just one analogy. Like, there's so much we don't understand, and so many places in which biology operates within the world. Think about everything from the Arctic to the ocean to the desert, and the functions that are encoded in those microbes and those plants and those organisms to allow them to withstand all of the different environments. We don't understand enough yet about what is actually accomplishing that so that we could leverage it in some of the biotech applications that Jason's already explained. So it's a huge opportunity for the industry, for scientists, and for the United States.
So that loops into the question I wanted to ask, which was to learn more about the tools that one needs to undertake biotechnology. So can you talk about from 1976 up to where we are today, what are the key changes in the tools that we've seen in terms of how they work and what their cost is to operate?
So the tools, and again, I would say the big progression is in the 70s and 80s and 90s, really, that window of time. We essentially had the tools of cut and paste biotech. Take a gene, move it from one species into another. And that might be into a microbe to make insulin and taking the gene from a human. It might be taking a gene from a bacteria and putting it in corn to make it kill insects so that you wouldn't need to add a pesticide, like whatever, right? Like it was cut and paste. And even the pasting was kind of poor. Like you couldn't paste it wherever you wanted. You could only paste it in certain spots. And in the plants, I swear to God, you would shoot it in with a machine called a gene gun, where you would put DNA on a gold nanoparticle, fire it through the plant because it had to get through the plant cell wall, and it would just hit somewhere at random in the genome. Okay. And again, remember, I think there's like computer scientists on this call. So imagine if when you compiled your code to the processor, it just landed somewhere random in memory. Okay. Like that, this is literally how we programmed. Okay. Like this is how we programmed in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Huge billion-dollar industries were built on installing the code at random. Okay. And I want people to understand this, because your question about the tools, Chris, is so critical, because our tools have been horrible. And yet industries worth hundreds of billions of dollars exist on biotech. The reason is the substrate is freakishly powerful. So even though all we can do is barely change a bacteria, barely change a corn, they are intrinsically, like, what else is it that can engage with the human body like a protein can? Nothing. There's no nanotechnology that can replace insulin, right? Like, and so it's just, there is these fundamentals on what biology can do that are so powerful that even bad tools of the 70s, 80s, 90s were hugely valuable. Okay. So then we kept working on the tools. In the 2000s, you had genomics to help you do the reading. And then I would say kind of 2010, 2020, you're entering the era of what people have been calling synthetic biology. Okay. And I'll let you know what I think are the three big tools underlying this. And they kind of mirror that era back in the Genentech era in the early 80s. Okay. The first one is the tool of DNA synthesis. So instead of cutting and pasting, I can now go on my computer, type ATC, GGG, whatever, hit print. And the leading company in the space, a company called Twist Biosciences, California-based company, they'll print the piece of DNA that I want. Whatever it is. Okay, I don't need to cut and paste anymore. I can just type in what I want. Okay, and it takes a little while to get it back. It depends on how big it is, 5 days to a couple weeks. And you're going to get a tube in the mail that has the code you want. Breakthrough. Okay, that did not exist previously. And even now, you still pay by the letter. So once again, for the computer scientists on the call, I want you to imagine that as you compile your code, each 0 and 1 costs you a few cents. Okay, right? So again, think of that as a limitation. All right. Second, remember the restriction enzymes that Genentech had, the scissors? The new ones are called CRISPR. Okay, and CRISPR allows you not to only cut at a defined sequence, like restriction enzymes would only cut in the same place every time. CRISPR, you can choose where you want to cut. And importantly, not just in microbes, you can also do it in plants and animals and humans, which is a huge breakthrough. Because remember before, Monsanto just shooting DNA randomly into the corn and picking and hoping it didn't mess up something and picking the winners. With CRISPR, you can pick where you put it. So it's way more efficient. You get way more success in terms of not messing up what's already there, because you can put it somewhere where you want to put it. And then the final one, or if you remember in the Genentech era, we had to understand how genes even turn on and off, the operon. The third technology is genomics. As we collect all that code data and we do all this high throughput automation to test what all those genomes do, we get a genotype, which is the DNA code, and a phenotype, which is laboratory automation produced data about what that genotype does in the world. And you put those two things together and you understand biology. And you especially do it, we can have a whole separate conversation about this, if you feed all that data into AI models. Okay, because you really want those models to learn from that giant corpus of data, many more operons, many more things about how biology works. So DNA synthesis, CRISPR to insert it, and then high throughput biology, a mix of genomics and high throughput assays with automation to learn biology faster than ever before. You put those three things together and you're in the synthetic biology era, which is the one we're in today. And I personally think this is the one that has compounding gains. So it's the one to me that's the first one to feel like semiconductors, right? Remember like pre-electronic semis, it was planar semiconductor manufacturing that created the fundamental pacing of Moore's law, and you just knew it was going to get better and better and better. These keep getting better. That's the big difference.
I was going to say, to that point of we're still on the inflection curve, right? It's still, as Jason just said, they're getting better all the time. We just talked about some of the gaps that still exist in just that corpus of knowledge, genomic information that we just don't have enough of yet. On the synthesis side, DNA synthesis, we're good at writing short amounts of code, but if you want to get longer and longer, that's technically challenging, and we haven't solved that yet. And so, and the CRISPR, right? New systems are coming out all the time with more efficacy, more fine tuning around what Jason's talking about, putting, the edit where you want, less error rates, less off target, utility. So those three technologies that Jason mentioned are still in rapid phases of acceleration. We're getting better at this all the time. New companies are forming around each of these intersections. And as he highlighted, as it's increasingly converging with artificial intelligence, with robotics and automation, that path of inflection and acceleration is just continuing to grow, that angle of acceleration. We're just getting more and more here, but we're not yet at, the stage of development that the semiconductor field and what folks may be more familiar with, other technologies and other industries, we're not there yet. The industry is still on an upward trend.
All right, we're we've had a nice 50-year run. We went from zero to $1 trillion industry. We got some great plant yields. We did some mRNA vaccines, saved the world from COVID, all that good stuff. But what you two are selling me is that the best is yet to come, and we're in the transformers are all you need for biotech, but a lot of the sort of innovations that are necessary to bring us into this brave new world are right on the horizon. So yeah, I don't know, walk us through the sort of let's do one more time the different curves that you're seeing that are particularly exciting, and how they feed together from your cloud labs to your AI predictive models to fun and friendly biomanufacturing. What's got both of you most excited?
Okay. I would say that the curves that I'm most excited about are DNA reading, that's genomics, DNA writing, and these are both getting cheaper, kind of like Moore's law-y kind of cheaper, DNA writing, and then laboratory automation to generate data about how cells work, right? Again, because we didn't design cells. So unless we actually measure them a lot, we don't really know how they work. And then the last one is the AI models you build on top of that big data asset. So it is reading DNA, writing DNA, lab automation, and you are starting to see cloud labs, like people with business models where that's outsourced, like an AWS. And then finally, AI models that put all of that data into a picture of how you do generative AI on DNA, which we can talk about.
Yep. I think the basis of what Jason's talking about is we need to understand the biology better. We then need to be more efficient in how we do that engineering that he's so nicely walked through. And then we need to do it at scale. And the reproducibility in science is difficult. Biology is living, right? It's inherently challenging to work with this discipline, with this matter. And so getting things out of a proof of concept at the lab to doing it in full scale, that insulin example, which sounds kind of simple in retrospect, actually to get that done at full scale and to actually make enough human insulin via a bacteria that can be used on our market is a massive undertaking that we shouldn't underappreciate. And it's one area that the field is kind of by and large struggling, is to move these basic lab innovations out of the lab into large scale and into full, production and manufacturing. And that comes back to, again, how much we know about the biology, how much we can engineer it. And as we start to pull all of these things closer together, do the engineering with manufacturability in mind, we start to transverse that curve from lab to market much quicker, which brings a lot more of these potential products and applications that we've been talking about to the general consumer.
Okay. So talk us through the cost dynamics. We mentioned Moore's law, declining cost per transistor at a historically unparalleled, I think, rate. But I understand there are some technologies in the biotech sphere that have had roughly comparable cost declines over the past couple of decades at least. So what has the cost trend looked like, and where do you see it going?
Yeah, this is a very good question. So the one that gets talked about the most is genomics. DNA reading has fallen faster than Moore's law over the last 20 years. So it has gotten dramatically cheaper. The first human genome project gets completed, roughly $100 million to sequence one genome. And today, companies like Illumina in San Diego, Beijing Genomics in China are both orbiting around about $100 for a human genome. So we've seen a 1 million-fold cost reduction in the last 24 years. So that's legit. That's like even legit to the same. And by the way, interestingly, the technology leans on semis when you get in the weeds on it. Different conversation.
Please. No. Let's get the 3-minute riff there. Yeah. So
these machines? So like in terms of the technology that Illumina is using to do this low cost sequencing, they are leaning on, not like the very latest in semiconductors, but on historical semiconductor manufacturing to make portions of their chips that do it's essentially a really high content imaging application to get this right. But you want to look at I don't even know what it is now, billions or something of little spots on these things that are each little pieces of the DNA. And so that process of fabbing that thing is very much driven out of progress in semiconductor. It's an overlapped technology. A totally different use case, completely different use case. Like this is like wet, there's chemistry going on this thing, and you're putting lives, couldn't be more different. But the lithography and all that is 100% piggybacked on progress in semis. Then of course, the other technology is getting less expensive is DNA writing. It's not gotten as cheap as quickly as DNA reading, that's for sure. So that's an area where I think you could see input of more investment, both government and otherwise, would I think really serve as an unlock. Because again, think of yourself as a computer programmer paying by the bit. When you compile your code, you would learn a lot slower. Your development cycles would be more expensive, and so on. So that's a real gate on the industry. And then importantly, how good. Again, imagine programming for a computer that you didn't know the computer architecture for, and no one had ever built an operating system for, or anything that simplified it, right? We're kind of installing assembly code, or even bit code straight into a machine, not of our design. So there's a whole world of improvement that is also just on the knowledge side that Michelle was highlighting. And that's where I think AI models are going to prove to be extremely important. And in fact, are already showing breakthroughs, and we can talk about that, Jordan, if you wanted to push a little in that direction, because, for example, in the design of proteins, AI models are now, I think, the best in the business. And so that is a new development, really, in the last 5 years or so, in the field.
I do think it's important at this stage to stop and highlight where we've been and where the field needs to go. Where we've been has historically been good matches for government funding, right? And we've heard, how government funding has supported that kind of basic R&D. We had this great challenge around the Human Genome Project. That sort of fundamental research is a function that the U.S. government does well and has supported kind of the basis of this industry. But as we have a field that needs to undergo some continual improvement in some of those technologies, which involves more directed types of human genome equivalent type national projects, as well as a transition out of lab for some of these capabilities and into the marketplace, and particularly for some of the defense applications of these technologies, which we haven't talked about yet, but we can go into more detail of how, the commercial market applications, and then how the Defense Department may want to use, some of the innovations around self-healing and materials and responsive materials. They're going to look different, right? And so that market shift, that strategic lens, and the transitioning of technology is something that the U.S. government has historically been poor at funding. That's not the function that the government has traditionally taken. Of course, that's changed with investments like CHIPS and Science and some of the recent, laws that have been passed around investing in infrastructure. We're starting to see the government use different tools around tech transition and fundamental types of non-fundamental types of investments, I should say. But that is an interplay with biotech where you're getting to a stage of development in the field that doesn't complement the historic U.S. government tools and means of funding.
Jason, AI and biotech. What are people so excited about?
Yeah, so I'll nerd out for 1 minute on how I think about AI and how you should think about it with regard to bio, because I actually think it has the potential to have a bigger impact in biotechnology than it has in human life. Okay, and I'll give you my justification why. But first, again, for maybe people who are a little newer to what's actually going on under the hood of AI, I want to make this point that the human language models, right, like OpenAI has built with ChatGPT and so on, are neural nets, okay, that were trained on big corpuses of human written sentences, but they themselves, the actual neural net, was not specifically designed for human language. It's a generic machine learning technique, okay? And very specifically how it works is you've got like a node, three nodes, right? Two up here at top connected by a line to a third one below it, just to simplify it, okay? And on the connectors are little weights, little numbers, okay? And this is, again, for the biologists, this ends up being kind of funny, but this is meant to mimic a brain, all right? Like a neural brain. Actually, neurons are quite different and more complicated. And actually do general intelligence, by the way. I just want to say we're still on top here in the bio world. Machines haven't done it yet. But it's meant to mimic that. So you've got node connected to one at the bottom. And what you do is you basically have a whole network of these things, and you then train it with a human written sentence. How do you do that? Okay, let's say the sentence has 10 words in it. You leave out a word. You leave out the fifth word, and you feed the other 9 into the top of this neural net, and it goes, sends little signals like this one fires, this one fires. They send their little weights to the one below it. And if those weights cross a threshold, this one fires. Okay. And it goes through, and out the bottom, there's a little thing that does the transformation. It tells you the missing word. And if it's right, you're like, good job, neural net. Nothing to do here. If it's wrong, you change some of the weights. And then you do it again. And then you leave out the second word. And then you do that for, billions and billions and billions of sentences, and over again. And if you do it enough, this little thing, which is just nodes and lines and weights, simple as that, eventually learns English grammar, right? It learns to write poems. It learns because it's seen so many of them before, that it learns our language without us having put that into the computer, us as the programmers of that neural net at any point. Okay, and that's very important because now I'm going to do the biological translation. A gene, all right, like a bacterial gene might be 800 ATCs and Gs long. It's read start to finish. It's like a paragraph. And I can feed it into a neural net, and I can leave parts out. And I can say, hey, predict what's missing. Just like you did when you gave it a human sentence, it does its best job predicting. And by the way, I know the gene because of genomics. I've been reading all these genes. And the key here is you have to have enough books. And so I leave out, train the net. And eventually it learns to speak DNA. Okay. Written in actual, like when we train it with human language, it was language written by humans. It's not just nonsense words. Okay. Right. We need actual coherent DNA language. Where do we get that? Nature. Okay. Remember I was mentioning earlier that's our code base. Okay. So we have all these genes in nature. We feed them in. Okay. And I swear to God, this thing is learning to speak DNA. And here's why I think it could be more impactful than in human language. Because we invented human language, right? So these computer brains are having to compete with us on our own terrain, right? You want to have a GPT lawyer? Well, it's competing in the field of law invented by humans, competing in contracts invented by humans, on top of the English language invented by humans. And we're asking it to be as good as our best. Meanwhile, over here in DNA land, I don't speak DNA. Do you speak DNA? We look at this stuff; it's incomprehensible alien gibberish, right? Like we don't speak it. So why couldn't the neural net learn to speak it? It learned to speak English. It learned to speak Chinese. I don't speak Chinese. GPT speaks Chinese better than I do. It will speak DNA better than I do, except no human on the planet speaks DNA. So these things are going to get superhuman dramatically in the design of DNA long before they get superhuman in the design of contracts. Long before. So that's why I think it's, I think a lot of what we're finding with the AI stuff is it's giving us efficiency gains. And everybody's hoping for general intelligence and yada, yada, we'll see. Okay. But for sure, it's going to do what we do now worse than us with language, but not in biotech. It's going to do what we do now better than us. And so it's potentially more disruptive in the biological domain than it is in the human language domain.
So where are we right now in the development of ChatGPT DNA version?
Hasn't happened yet. We have not had our ChatGPT moments. This is a very important point, something we're thinking about a lot with the commission when it comes to what's the US AI strategy. This in bio, it's have ChatGPT for bio happen in the US before it happens somewhere else. It's not yet defend the and okay, who's got what right? Because we haven't had the ChatGPT moment yet. The bones are there, like it should work, right? But there's some missing pieces. Do we have enough DNA code? Do we have enough? If you think about the image models, it wasn't just the image, it was also the labeling of the image. This is a dog, ImageNet, the big thing, the database they use to train image models. Here's a picture, it's a dog. Here's a picture, it's a balloon, right? Well, here's a gene, it does what? Okay, so we also need, you can talk about these cloud labs, and we need to generate the data sets that do the labeling of what all that DNA does, and then we need tons of that. Okay, and so it's going to be who builds the data asset first. Does that make sense?
How will we know when we've gotten ChatGPT for DNA? Like, what will that look like? And
great question.
What will make
I don't
us
know
say,
what it will look like for ChatGPT. So
right.
Remember OpenAI was trying all the, maybe it'll be robots, maybe it'll be this thing, maybe it'll be plans, whatever, soda, right? Like it's like, they didn't know, right? Like, I think there's like, we're going to see, and there's been little hints, right? Like famously Google, created a product called AlphaFold. Remember AlphaGo for playing Go? They made AlphaFold for, there's a certain nerd problem in biology. That's if I give you a sequence of DNA, what protein shape does it make? Proteins are the little like pieces of nanotechnology inside cells that do things. And scientists have been trying to predict that forever, failing. They run a competition every year where somebody secretly figures out what the protein shape is in the lab, doesn't tell anybody, and has all these computational people try to predict it. And then the winner is whoever predicts the most of the 50 that year. Okay. And in 2020, Google, 2018, AlphaFold came in and did okay, middle of the pack. In 2020, they basically ended the competition.
Now, I have two answers for you, Chris. One metric that we could look for to see that we've reached the ChatGPT moment in biology is actually getting the outcome we want with the products that are being designed through AI. And so an example of this is, most of the drugs that go through clinical trials today fail. Like 95% of the drugs that we put in a clinical trial will not succeed, will not actually make it to patients. And artificial intelligence, kind of these older tools, have started designing drugs, new drugs, having new targets, new types of molecular interactions. They're uncovering this, but it has not yet had the effect we wanted to see on the drug market. So maybe we're at like 6 to 8% now drugs are going through clinical trials. When we start seeing that number go way up, 70%, 80%, much more efficacious, much more efficacious drugs with targets that are clearly defined, clinical trials that are designed through use of artificial intelligence tools, we will see the output in terms of more numbers of successful drugs coming to market and coming out of clinical trials. So that's one output. I do think a second thing that we need to look at, though, is that we may not know when we've hit the ChatGPT moment in biology in the same way that we did for ChatGPT, because by and large, these tools and these applications are being designed by independent companies, by private companies. These are proprietary tools, proprietary data sets. And unlike the ChatGPT moment where we had this function that was released to the world that you could type in a question and get these answers and actually play around and see for yourself that, everyone could get the sense of how much this tool had developed and how efficient it was at answering your questions and writing stories and generating grocery lists and things like that. We may not have that. Sorry, I don't know what that sound was. Let me say that again. We may not have that same moment in biology. These tools may not be accessible to the broader public. And so we may reach that moment inside individual companies, inside individual countries, and may not understand from a broader societal perspective that we've actually reached that moment. And so looking for these delayed outputs in terms of, are we seeing more products to market? Are we seeing things that designs that we've never seen before in nature? That's another element here, is that even though we talked about how we don't even know enough about biology itself has only tried so many combinations of potential proteins, sequences, right? So the ability to design things de novo, anew, things we've never seen before with new functions, that's also the potential here. Once we start to see that actually hitting mainstream products market, I think those are kind of the two sets, the sense that we will have reached that moment, but it may only be delayed and after the fact that we've actually gotten there.
And just to hammer that home, Michelle, like the idea of going from like 8% to like 50% is crazy. Like you basically have to have like AI predictive models of like an entire, biological system, and not just a microbe, but like a human or a monkey or something. And the Jason, explain this better than I can.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I think what's interesting is I think what we're learning with the human language models is like, we don't need like a perfect model of a system, right? Like, we're not trying to do physical simulation with neural nets. We're trying to do extreme pattern matching.
Yeah.
And so, I think you'll still like the way you'll do this, for example, would be to collect huge amounts of data in human cells, right, in the lab, about how different types of things affect them. So that, and by different types of things, let's say in this case, proteins, because that's what we're kind of talking about. And then you're going to use that to train a model to say, well, if I design a protein, how do I make it so that it doesn't like set off your immune system, which is like one of the common ways that, a cancer therapy might fail, right? Is if you have some overwhelming immune response that like hurts more than it helps, then that's a failed clinical trial. So how do you make it so that when you design these proteins, that never happens? Well, collect enough data about what immune responses you see in response to a wide range of things, and the neural net will pull the pattern. We might not actually have a model that encompasses the whole human immune system or something. It doesn't matter, as long as it's seen enough coherent sentences that are actually written to not set off your immune system, it'll be able to write them. Just like it can write enough Shakespeare, even though it doesn't like have a model of his head.
Sure.
And then there's other models too that are not based on this type of fundamental DNA language that Jason's talking about, but you can design AI models to go through health data, health records, clinical trial information to actually design the trial better. So you're pulling in the right populations, understanding the targets you want to achieve, do that all on the beginning end. So it's not just the drug itself, but every application of making the drug, the robotics involved, right? Each of those will involve artificial intelligence at some level. It's just going to be different types of data sets, different models, but the entire pathway can stand to be accelerated from getting a drug from design all the way into someone's arm, approved by the FDA, and then to market by different sorts of combinations of artificial intelligence tools and data sets.
Awesome. So we have a potential future unlocked where we have robots in labs doing tests, AI helping to model drug simulation, and all of a sudden we go from what's today $1 trillion market to $10 trillion, and we get to grow the best tasting, most efficient corn you've ever had, live forever, and do lots of cool stuff. But I guess the sort of question here is and kind of coming back to the whole purpose of the commission is what role does government have to play? I think, looking at the AI analogy, if you pulled the plug on NSF computer science funding in 2010, say, you probably still would have, you still had enough infrastructure and support, going on in corporate R&D to unlock your ChatGPT moment, 7 to 10 years later. As you're thinking about the question of, to what extent, where are we in that kind of life cycle to our like supernova of biotech capabilities? Like, what's the right way to conceptualize where we are in that trajectory, and what you can expect, VCs and CVCs to be developing, and where the government is still needing to play the role in like kind of unlocking this, glorious future.
I'll let Michelle talk over this. Yeah, but maybe before I jump in, I will, before we leave the like application side, I will say my favorite, everyone always thinks drugs and the things you can do with biology today. But my favorite future application actually for this stuff is going to be in chip manufacture, semiconductors. Yeah. The like biology places atoms really well.
So I think, it's clear that the pharmaceutical applications will continue to be developed, right? There is a market for drugs, high performance drugs, and we're seeing more and more types of drugs enter the market all the time. We have the GLP-1 targets, the new weight loss drugs. These are reaching more and more people. These have the ability to not reach just a specific defined clinical population, say someone that's suffering, from a heart disease or a cancer, but actually large percentages of our population. And so we'll see more and more of those types of drugs that have larger and larger market sizes. The market will always, I think, continue to bear out some of those advances. What we will struggle to see, in my view, without additional government support or strategic resources, are some of those other applications. Jason mentioned some of the ag tech examples and the differences in placing genes in plants versus in bacteria, right? There's still some fundamental research that needs to be accomplished with our understanding of plants, how to engineer them. It's much more challenging than doing it in microbial cells. And so if we look towards agricultural applications, there's some more role for non-dilutive sorts of funding and for government funding. And then the industrial sector is a completely secondary, or the industrial sector is a completely different story, where there's the potential for biotech to make products that displace some of the industry incumbents. And so you can look at replacing petrochemicals with biologically produced sources of those chemicals. But the market doesn't support that today, right? There is policies, history of these large petroleum companies and entire industries founded around the use of petrochemicals to make plastics materials form the basis of our supply chain. And while there may be strategic reasons or environmental reasons to diversify away from traditional sources of supply chains and use potentially biotechnology and biomanufacturing to make those products instead, without additional support from governments, we're unlikely to see that play out. And we're seeing how on the international stage, different governments are tackling this in different ways. And how in Europe, for example, where they have specific kind of sticks around carbon emissions, there's more of a push to develop biotech in this way in order to accomplish those policy goals of the European Union. And so there are areas where the market will continue to drive biotech, and then there are areas where there is no market or there's no market today.
All right, so we have some like R&D gaps. Are there, like, reading your report, it just sounded like it's kind of a mess in terms of like who is in charge of this, who it doesn't seem like there's, it's basically you two thinking strategically about this, but not a sort of institutional home for this. What are the different constituencies that like should be caring about all these things? And why haven't we had 20 years of like a nice, cute, integrated biotech strategy to push all this stuff forward in a thoughtful way?
We have to say that, of course, there's lots of people thinking about this. I come from the government. There's plenty of smart government people thinking about bio, but I think it is it is in one way is a symptom of biotech, but it's also a diagnostic of our entire government as a whole, right? We have not historically from a government been able to support convergent technologies. And as we've heard, biotech is inherently, as it accelerates, a convergent technology. It's not just biotech, it's biotech and AI. It's biotech, AI, and automation. There's applications for semiconductors. Both semiconductors need to be used in the underlying equipment. And then Jason will tell you the story of, how biotech can transform semiconductor manufacturing in the future. There's a quantum aspect potentially in computing. So it is really this grand convergence of technologies, and our government just doesn't do that well. We are siloed. We have different agencies with different priorities, and so each agency has its mission. It has its its swim lanes, and they are moving biotech in that direction of that swim lane, and they're doing it by and large well. There's great programs, great scientists, and you see that kind of translation of very early R&D into kind of applied R&D. But the function of our government to continue that transition and look beyond those defined mission areas and swim lanes is just not something that the USG has historically done or done well. So biotech, I think, can be used as an exemplar for emerging technologies as a whole. All of the technologies are increasingly converging. We know that we struggle as a government with transitioning technologies and hard technologies, getting them beyond the lab into market. And so we need to look at how we can apply the new tools that we put into place, where we might need additional tools, and how we can break down some of the silos within the government that exist, regardless of what technology you're talking about, in order to arrive at some of the outcomes that we all, I think, can agree upon would be great for the United States.
Like, what do you think is the origin of like the side, like where the convergent tech? I think you're right about this. Is often the case that AI is very much the interface of ML and GPUs or something. Like, why is it hard to do that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have to think that it comes down to fundamentally the way that we're trained in these technologies. And it's already challenging to get scientists within government. Those that are there were trained a while ago, right? And Jason, as you and I know from when we were trained, there was historically a lens around single disciplinary training, right? And now we're moving into these multidisciplinary programs. But those people who can speak AI and bio and semiconductors are still unicorns and are widely needed and desirable in the tech front, where they can recoup massive salaries and contribute to driving forward tech. And so getting those people on the government who actually understand that is, I think, one hurdle that limits sort of the understanding of our policymakers to actually identify and navigate the intersection. I think the other is just the mission space of these agencies, right? Like, our agencies are, besides the Commerce Department, which kind of has a broad commerce lens, our Energy Department does energy, our Health Department does health, our Defense Department can kind of fit all of those in, but of course in the lens of the military. So we think about biotech being applied, it's done so under those domains. And so we're creating artificial boundaries between biotech for health and energy and defense, where we could, if our system was done differently and not at those, at the agency level, we could see where we could apply biotech or R&D priorities that could advance all of those missions, not individually, but in, parallel or in a concerted fashion.
Yeah. It's interesting to sort of think about the comparison to the AI executive order, right? Where you had like literally every department in government is like coming up with their own strategy. It's the sort of degree of difficulty is even higher when it's not like the one thing that the government is trying to do, right? And it's this like secondary thing where we're really excited about what it's going to do for us in, 2027 or 2030 versus like post ChatGPT, right? Where,
That's
you
right.
have the president talking about this all the time. So like doing the sort of like horizontal approach to stuff for a system that like doesn't do horizontal unless the White House is screaming at it to do it is just a very tricky sort of structural thing for the U.S. government to wrap its head around.
And then if we put in the lens of competition with China, right, that's where concerns can come in, because we don't look at that in a cross-cutting way, and their system does, right? They're more inherently risk tolerant. They can fund things from a top-down perspective in a way that is not encumbered by our government system in the way that ours is. course, there's limitations in their system as well. But for that alone and the ability to potentially systematically look at emerging tech in a way that our system has struggled with, we should be concerned about, our ability to outcompete in all of these domains, and therefore what we need to do to address those inefficiencies in our system.
Yeah, one question on how to think about the economics of all this. So we've got government funding basic research. We've got capital markets that, at least from my perspective, put in a lot of money to biotech firms. Maybe not enough, we can argue, but a fair amount. Where are there funding deficits right now? Is it in sort of scaling up capital intensive parts of the business, or how do we think about that?
On the emerging biotech side, I think like for new tooling, like I would say the analogy I would give you is, Common Crawl, which was like that big internet text database, and OpenAI is getting sued by New York Times or something about their stuff being in Common Crawl. But like that was the big text database that basically all the foundation models trained on for human language. And then there was ImageNet, which was like an open source image, and people had more of their own labeling data too for other things. But like, it was a big labeled image data set that for people like Midjourney and stuff like that to train on. And then they took it from there. Right now, there's a lot more custom proprietary stuff that people are fighting over what they, fine. But like there were these big public sets that were available to researchers to just work on, to try to work on the problem of AI in the domain of images and human language. We need those in biology. Like we have like little like light bits and pieces of them. The protein data bank was the thing that AlphaFold trained on. It was like their version of ImageNet, but they're like few and far between. And so that I think is an area where the government could lead to create some of those shared public assets that basically then allow open-ended research to happen in the beautiful way it does in the United States, where people just do it permissionless. They don't have to be blessed by the government, like go to town. But we need those core assets. I think are things that, with the right little bit of push, from the government, can create an enormous amount of innovation downstream in our system. Would be one example on that side. And no VC would fund the creation of ImageNet, right? It's a systems benefit. It's not a benefit to that company. And one company back before we knew if this stuff would even work wouldn't pay to create all that data. So that's a place where there's a gap.
Yeah, in addition to the platform technologies that Jason's talking about, which are less suited for VC funding, as Jason's mentioned, it's also the application areas. And so I talked a little bit about this before, but most of the VC funding that you see, and yes, biotech is a venture-backed discipline, but primarily for biomedical applications, not for the ag tech, not for the industrial biotech, and firms that are trying to orient around applications that are not for the medical system are really struggling, to receive financing. And the time horizons are still the same, right? The time horizons are as long for ag tech and industrial biotech, but the potential return is less so than you get on the pharmaceutical side. And so you have less of that push from a market perspective. There's also less success stories. We're not seeing as much of this novel biotech yet being applied in these sectors simply because the margins aren't the same as in the pharmaceutical sector. And so there are gaps in private capital as well, especially if we want to try to push biotech outside of the medical arena.
Jason, like, you don't come from this world. I'm curious, like, how has your experience, interacting with the policy community and trying to introduce them to your technology area been? What sort of reflections do you have so far?
Yeah, I mean, maybe one point I would make just to the folks that are like listening to this, the whole point of the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotech is to collect input from the community and then turn that into information for the government, right? Like we are a congressional committee. We're we're reporting to the Armed Service Committees. Like our job is to help summarize what's going on and make some recommendations. So people on this call who like live at that interface of emerging technologies and national security, whether it's in semiconductors or what, have a lot of insight about that interface between emerging technology and national security. So please do reach out. We're, biotech.senate.gov is the website, and you can figure out how to reach out to the commission. Like there's staff, right? Like their job is to collect that information. So first off, I would encourage people to just engage. right? I think there's one of the things I've realized is how independent the government community is from private sector, is yet again, even from academia. Like it's like sort of, they're just these very different worlds. And I think it's in part just because people don't feel like it's their place to engage. Right. And so and in some cases, there's not a lot of perfect spots to engage, but I think something like these congressional commissions is actually an instance where that's the point of it. Right. And so I would encourage folks to just take that opportunity. It's certainly been very valuable for me just to understand better how this gets done. For me, as a US citizen, I think it's really important that we win in emerging technology areas. And so I'm like happy to be participating in that. But I do think it surprised me. There's like great people in both domains, but there's so little crossover. I think it's a weakness, honestly, in our system as a whole. And so I don't know the right solution to that. I think more things like what I'm doing right now, which is like a time limited thing where I can still, with a little, if there's effort to this, because they care what you invest in, all this other stuff. But like, you can still participate in for a period of time while having your other job. I think more of that would go a long way in the government. I think it's a good idea. Or just anything that's time banned, right? Like, come do this, take a sabbatical, do it for a year or two and leave, right? Like more of that would be awesome. Cause I think it has been valuable, certainly for me, to go back to my fellow, leaders in the biotech space and say, you should engage here, here, and here in the government if you want to actually, like they're not like they want your input, right? Especially when it comes to national security. So I think people mostly think about interacting with the government on like some regulatory trench war that they've been fighting for. That's usually the only thing the private sector thinks about. But I think especially as you look at these like kind of, competition with other states, like there is an effort where the government is plugging into these areas of emerging technology. And like, we keep our system totally separate, it's not perfect. Like I think we got to cross that. We'd be better at crossing that divide. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah.
And then on the
Michelle,
reverse, Jason, your company has actually been successful in hiring government employees, right? Former government employees.
Right. Yeah. Right. 100%.
And they go back, right? And that's also something that's lacking, is the ability for government officials to actually understand what's happening in tech companies.
Get jobs in the private sector.
Yeah. And understand the financial realities, which we've touched on this call for this sector, some of the, where the tech actually is, the state of play, how the intersection between public and private capital actually works. This is, what are the motivations of a private company? Most of the government and the folks that are making policies about this are removed from the companies that we're trying to promote or protect, right? And so I think Jason and Ginkgo have interestingly done a good job of bringing folks on, and then some folks go back, and that sort of dynamic as well is needed. More government officials having spent time in the private sector and coming back and being able to impact policies from what they've learned from their time, in the outside world.
Yeah, so we had a really fun time horizon scanning on this podcast, but it seems like the government just like doesn't do it or has a hard time. Is this just because Newt Gingrich killed the Office of Tech Assessment 20 years ago, or do you think there's something more structural going on, Michelle, where just if you're a civil servant in Washington, you're not best set up to do this sort of thing?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. The tech is not happening inside the government anymore. We talked about kind of the government funding for technology. Not only has it declined, but most of these technologies we're talking about are, while they have defense applications, are not oriented to the Defense Department or to the national security community. So it is the private sector, it is the private scientists and companies that are at the leading edge of the technology and therefore understand better than anyone else where it is going, the state of play today, the technical challenges, hurdles, et cetera. I think it's too much to expect the government to be able to do that in addition to its functions. And so recommendations of how we do better at this, I think, are along the lines of what we've just been talking about. How do we get more of that intersection and interplay between the private sector and the public sector, opportunities for in and out and, sort of collaboration. But I don't think it's realistic to expect the government to be able to horizon scan in the way that someone in the private sector could.
All right.
Maybe I just again as an outsider, I'm a little more like optimistic that I think we kind of made this choice somewhere along the line, because like if you look back in the 40s and 50s, that sort of post World War II era, obviously government was doing big technological projects all the way through the Apollo program and so on and so forth. Sam and OpenAI. Remember, so OpenAI was a nonprofit when it started, right? If you had just given Sam Altman the budget to do OpenAI in the government, he would have done it. Right? Like this idea that the government can't recruit like amazing people to do amazing technological things is not true. That they just think they can. Right. And then they also have a system where they're kind of like not pulling, like recruit the best person in the world and give them the budget. Don't recruit the person that's been in the government system for X amount of time. When you're talking about these high tech, you're saying, oh, the technology, great. That's probably true. Great. So then recruit the person out of the private sector, give them the budget, put them in charge of it. Right. Like you could get the best people in the world if you did that, right?
Yep.
You could get Elon to run NASA, right? Like you would just need to give them the budget, right? Like I swear to God, this would work. And so I think it's false to think that government doesn't have that power. You've got the checkbook, man. Like the budgets are bananas, right? And what these people want is impact, right? So I don't think it's quite as simple, right? Like it's just the government doesn't think it could do capital allocation like that anymore, but it certainly used to.
But I think that's the point you're talking about, Jason. It's doing technological things, right? You're not going to get those scientists in to just horizon scan for the government so they can.
No, horizon scan is
Right?
point. No, they need to do it, right? Like it's got to be the Manhattan Project. It's got to be, it's got to be Apollo program. It's got to be make me AI, right? Like land me rockets, whatever it is you want, right? And like you get the people, but you got to be willing to actually take the risk on it and give them the other thing they get in the private sector is control. Right? Like they get to spend that money the way they want to spend it. Right. And so that's the other thing that, so there's some mix there, whether you can pull that off, blah, blah, blah. But like, I don't see why you couldn't if you could structure it that way. You certainly could recruit the people. They're not the problem if you gave them the money and the leverage.
All right, Michelle, national security and biotechnology. Make the pitch.
Okay. So we've talked about a lot of the economic potential, right? And the ability to solve for big strategic goals within the United States. Things like taking entire disease off the table, solving for food security, addressing environmental challenges. These have huge economic potential, which we shouldn't diminish. From the national security side, we can apply some of the same technologies for specific priorities that will increase the national security of the United States. On a strictly supply chain perspective, which as we saw in COVID, was increasingly fragile. We depend on foreign sources or sole sources for a lot of the inputs to our economy. And this creates not only economic challenges, but national security challenges. Biotech can help us there, right? And so we've talked about the potential to use biomanufacturing as a way to replace fragile foreign sole sources of supply chains for critical chemicals and products that we rely on every day. And that were defined through COVID as having vulnerabilities. So an example is active pharmaceutical ingredients. This is a core component of our drugs. The supply chain around these are murky. We don't actually know where a lot of these core components are coming from, but it's clear that the majority are not coming from the United States, right? We have to source a lot of these ingredients, which puts our population at risk in the time of crisis if we cannot get and secure the necessary ingredients to make our drugs and treat our population. And a lot of these drugs are being imported through China. Again, how much is still unclear, but it is clear that they are an important node in that supply chain. And right now, these active pharmaceutical ingredients are either sourced from nature, they can be made through chemical manufacturing, chemical synthesis. This type of chemical manufacturing is a dirty way to make these products. It creates a lot of toxic runoff. It's high energy intensive, so it's not the best working environment. You can do it at really low cost. But because of this, it's one of the reasons that these types of manufacturing were offshored from the United States, right? We don't necessarily want this type of manufacturing in our backyard anymore. However, we could instead make new means of production for these active pharmaceutical ingredients using biomanufacturing. So creating cell factories that instead are engineered to produce those chemicals through their metabolic pathways. And these would be environmentally friendly. They would not create the toxic outputs. They're, worker-friendly jobs, the types of things you'd want to see in your backyard in your district. So from just a pure supply chain perspective, we can transform our supply chain through biomanufacturing, which increases our national security. And this supplies our Defense Department too, right? Our Department of Defense relies on foreign sources and sole sources of critical components of their supply chain in the same way that our broad economy does. And biomanufacturing could be used as drop-in replacements for those products. But it also can create not just a replacement, but new enhanced capabilities and enhanced performance. So one of those is just by the means of doing this manufacturing instead of traditional manufacturing. You can think about the size and the ability to scale by manufacturing. We use like a lot of times the beer brewing analogy, right? So you can think of full scale beer manufacturing, like that happens at a national company, down to like your local brewery, down to if you're a home brewer and do it in your house, right? That's scalable. It's also more portable. You can do it on demand. You can do it where you want it. So you think about logistics on demand and the ability to supply and resupply troops with fuels, with lubricants, with energetic precursors, with medicines, right, in the theaters in which they need them. So not having to rely on really time-intensive and potentially disruptible supply chains to get our military what they need where they need it. So massive capability unlocked if we can do that at scale. Beyond just a manufacturing platform, though, there's also capabilities that will help our Department of Defense. And so we're looking at, materials that can sense and respond to a potential weapon and be able to identify if a soldier has been impacted by a weapon. We're looking at fuels that provide long-range munition power because they're higher energy density. Temperature coatings that can withstand hypersonic flight and can be used to enable that entire discipline. The capability potential is, again, we're just scratching the surface of what is possible because all of that basic research and what we understand about biology is even slower to translate to the Defense Department. And so the more we understand about the functionality of bio, the more we understand about the mission space of the Defense Department, we can increasingly integrate those. And it was only in 2018 that the Department of Defense announced biotech as a technology priority area. Of course, the department had been funding biotech for some time, but now it is a strategic level, whole of department priority, which starts to orient the department around achieving these goals.
Michelle, like, that's cool, but I mean, I want to jump 10 feet tall and live forever and have, bullet wounds heal themselves. Where are we on that timeline? And, how is the department thinking about potentially taking advantage of the sci-fi stuff?
Yeah. So we talked a lot about, how biotech can be used for manufacturing, for supply chain, for logistics on demand, these capabilities that are more near term. But as you indicate, there are some, more far future applications of biotechnology that could really transform the military environment and operating environment. And some of these are really exciting potential to keep our warfighters safe or heal them, in the field. But we're really at the beginning stage of some of this exploration. So I like to break it apart into a couple of different domains where biotech is going to have capability potential for the department. So one is just on broad military capabilities. So your stuff, your hardware, think tanks, think clothing, the things that equip and serve our military service members, but not them themselves. And so we've talked about how biotech can provide drop-in replacements for the materials and capabilities and products that the Defense Department uses today. But we're also seeing the potential for enhanced capabilities in those products. So materials that are responsive potentially, that are able to detect something in the environment and respond accordingly and impact back to the service member. These are still all research stage, but it's really exciting potential. The next domain is human performance. And so from the Department of Defense, a lot of this is around training. How do we design the right atmosphere with which to deploy our soldiers, understand how to train different people for different environments. But there's also some interesting basic research around microbiome treatments, for example. So giving someone like a probiotic that could respond to what's going on in their body. And let's say they need, they're tired, they need a kick of energy, being able to deliver that and respond to someone's performance in real time. Those are, again, early stage, basic lab types of capabilities, but things that are interesting to think about.
Yeah.
And then probably more traditional applications that one thinks about when they think about biotech and the Department of Defense are around military medicine. How do we heal someone? This could be something like regenerative medicine, new tissues, new, synthetic blood, potentially even, entirely new organs or, features like that, which are, again, still far out there, but really exciting to think about. And then medicine at the point of need. So being able to make some of those biological products where they're needed, where someone may be injured or hurt. And then finally, chem biodefense. And so how do we respond to the threat that may be provided by biology, by someone misusing that or chemical weapons, and being able to employ biotech as a solution space. So all of those are, under exploration at the Department of Defense. As I've said multiple times, these are nascent, depending on what you're talking about. But really, there's a lot of cool proof of concepts, lab research, partnerships with academia and with companies that are developing some of the starting materials for some really cool capabilities that can impact everything from the systems that our warfighters use to what they're wearing to, how they can be fed or healed as needed and where needed.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of interesting themes to pick up on there. Like, I don't know, the perfect book to give to like a 21-year-old into like just starting to get into like Nazis. This book called Blitzed: Drugs in the Third Reich, which basically like makes this argument that, every Nazi soldier was up for 20 hours a day because they were all on speed. And that was like fine for year 1 and year 2 of World War II, but sort of tails off. And like, people have been drinking coffee before going into battle, like, for millennia now, and thinking about, what that can do from from a bioenhancement perspective of like doing a better job on this is really interesting. I guess my question for you, Michelle, for a lot of these different things is like, it's not just military applications where people are going to be excited to like take a pill and get smarter, or be able to sleep less, or be able to heal a wound from a car accident or what have you. So what is your sense of the role of what of what like particularly like defense oriented funding needs to be doing for this versus like all the stuff that Jason talked about earlier, where once we hit these exponentials that are going to have, enormous commercial outcomes that will sort of end up flowing down into these military ones as well.
Yeah, I think you raise a great point where I think a lot of the actual acceleration of this technology is going to be in the commercial space, and not even in the medical space, but in sort of the performance type of less regulated kind of arena, right? Like that's beyond FDA. If you want to take a caffeine supplement, right, that's not prescribed, right? And so there's this. Is there
a biohacking scene in the executive branch, Michelle?
A biohacking scene?
Yeah. I don't know. People, this is like a thing online. Like people take like random supplements and like see how they do. And I mean, this.
No. I think we're going in a rabbit hole, Jordan.
Well, no, I think it is kind of interesting. It is interesting though, because like, there's when you're talking about this sort of bioenhancement stuff, like there's an Ozempic, right? Which is like going to go, it's like a design drug by a large place, which is going to sort of like percolate up. But I think there's also this sort of universe of, I mean, like I remember like thinking maybe I could make myself smarter. I had like what the hell is that thing called? Like a transcranial stimulation thing. I started doing that before I was gonna learn Chinese, being like, oh, it'll help me learn flashcards better. Like it's a sort of interesting interaction between like the hacker universe of this stuff, which isn't necessarily going to, create you the awesome database of how the proteins folds. But I do think there's like, gains that are on the table somewhere with that.
And we haven't even talked about brain computer interfaces and some of those, potential applications. But I think this is where the role of the government comes in, right? And where the Department of Defense kind of seeding a lot of basic research capabilities. But, then a lot of that goes into the commercial or academic world and will be continued to be developed by industry and outside of government, right? And so that's where having the U.S. government continue to fund or support translational research, as we talked about, but doing so with ethics and guidelines, standards, norms in mind. Again, we're not close to being able to do some of the things you just described, and where the actual limit actually is. I think, we could have lots of discussions around what is science fiction and what is theoretically possible. But it's clear that we're just at this inflection point, as we've talked about earlier. And so it again enforces that governments, regulators, those who are responsible for protecting kind of the population and the citizens of the world, do so in mind with this technology and other emerging technologies like it, with the sense of how to use appropriate guardrails and limits and norms. And it's why I think we're so concerned that if the United States and its partners and allies do not lead out, and others do that have different sense of values and where limits might be in the technology, that could result in a radically different future than one where the United States continues to remain on top.
Sure. So tease that out for a second. I mean, what are the sort of like big ethical fights in the emerging biotech world?
Yeah. So, biotech, like most technologies, is dual use, right? And we've talked a lot about the human aspect. And I think there's a couple of things. All of the potential applications need to be informed by those who will end up using them or being impacted by those applications. And Jason mentioned some of the original gene editing in crops and how different groups' feelings about that and different sensitivities or mistrust of that technology led to different countries embracing gene edited crops in different magnitudes in different ways. That will trickle down throughout all of the potential applications of biology. It's one of the reasons why bioliteracy is such a pivotal part of the work we're doing at the Commission, which we talked about, I think, earlier, of making sure that individuals have the right tools and expertise to understand biotechnology, to engage in it, to be part of its development. But I think wherever, the technology intersects with the human, there's going to be ethical considerations that need to come into play. And we've talked about, the potential for human enhancement. It's not, it shouldn't be a surprising thing to add into this conversation that, the CRISPR and gene editing, we saw that kind of on the main stage when China and Chinese scientists were the first to use that technology in embryos and actually developing children with some of that edited technology, using some of that edited technology at a time when I think the global stage and the global norm around that was that the technology was not ready for that application. So it's one edge case, but it just describes that, there's the potential to leverage this technology before it is, ready for prime time, if you will, in applications that may not align with, with our values here in the United States and in like-minded countries. That could be concerning and need to have appropriate guardrails associated with that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's the broad kind of, there's like the Gattaca questions, right? But I mean, is there like a qualitative difference between someone signing up for an experimental like drug treatment and having that just be like a CRISPR associated one? I mean, I'm sort of missing like what's particularly, are there sort of new and novel ones beyond, experimental drugs?
The unique part about that was there's actually changing the underlying genetic code of those embryos, right? So it wasn't a drug that was a transient effect. It was an actual genome modification at a time when, as we talked about earlier, there's still off-target effects with this type of editing technology. There's still the potential for it to happen, not where you necessarily direct it, but in other parts of the genome. And again, one specific example, but it shows that and it also takes into place sort of consent, right? And how do you, if you are signing up for a drug trial, you're consenting likely to that, to being a part of that trial and having, that drug applied to your body and have a sense of what could happen to that. So, I think the main point is that there's a lot of intricacies with how these technologies will continue to be developed. And it again is so important that happens, with norms and standards in place and appropriate guardrails.
So speaking of China, why should I be worried if, I don't know, China broadly defined, has my DNA?
Yeah, so the genetic information is a good one. I think we talked about earlier about how genetic information and sort of the code base is going to be the underlying, one of the underlying elements that is driving the future of biotechnology, right? And whoever has the largest code base or the most diverse code base in this case has a chance to win out. And so we're looking at the connection of AI and biotech. That's very important from a competitive angle. From an individual level, your genetic code is specific to you. It's identifying as a person. And there are, some inherent risks to someone being able to identify you as a person, just from an individual level. If you think about blackmail or sort of other sorts of types of targeting of an individual. Now, you and I might not be worthwhile of being targeted by a nation state, but it's something
yourself,
to think
Michelle.
about. But, it's something to think about. And then from sort of a macro level, right, we talk about all of the potential for good and commercial success out of building out a large code base for biology and being able to design products against it. We must also be mindful that that same sort of information could spur, the development of biological weapons that could evade detection, evade our ability to respond to them. And it's something that we're mindful of sort of this unknown potential that would be damaging and detrimental to our system if developed and utilized.
Sorry, so is that a drug that kills, is that like a virus that only kills Jordan Schneider based on my DNA? Or what are you getting at there?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's what is theoretically possible. We're still at the early stages of being able to understand that. But it's clear that AI and bio is being applied together at the very beginning stages of being able to design new biology, right? I think we're at the level of small molecules. It's working somewhat well. We talked about this in the drug space. Proteins were at the beginning stages of that. Getting to the level of a virus and a higher order organism, we're still away from that. But, I think the potential consequence of this and what capabilities that intersection could enable from a misuse and a weaponization perspective is still unknown and therefore something we need to be mindful of.
Gotcha. So let's talk a little bit about the levers. We just had the CHIPS Act, which sort of ran a version of a playbook to support an industry where you had sort of manufacturing incentives as well as this, big R&D tax breaks, and then this large $13 billion research initiative, which we'll see what comes of it. What sort of let's stay on the promote side, I guess, for a second. What do you think would make the most sense if you could talk Chuck Schumer and Mike Johnson into giving our lovely biotech industry a cool $20 billion?
So at the commission, we're still looking at what formal recommendations we're going to make around those lines. But we're looking at all those areas that you identified, right, and that we've talked about earlier. Basic research, the needs, at a fundamental biology level, the tools associated with that, the data sets that might be needed in a government role in helping researchers to build out, open source data sets that could enable the next generation of AI and bio tools. We're looking at infrastructure. We're looking at talent. So no formal recommendations yet. Those will come in our report a year from now. But as Jason highlighted earlier, it's a good time to reach out to us and engage. And what the order of magnitude is. What's the right amount? What is needed for this industry? What are good pilots or models that could be scaled. How would this work and how would this function and who is best to carry it out on the government side? Those are all questions we're exploring right now and really appreciate inputs from the community as we tackle these challenges and these open questions.
Okay, so TBD. So on the protect side, I mean, I think the thing that is sort of most worrisome for me sitting here in March 2024 is the kind of like unknown long tail of like China pharmaceutical dependencies, where like all of a sudden, like, you know, if you think people are going to be upset about rare earths, like just wait till you take away their insulin and Tylenol. But sort of beyond that, which seems like an obvious thing that should be sort of researched and resourced around, what are the what are the other futures where like sort of Chinese leverage against, you know, over the rest of the world with respect to biotechs becomes uncomfortable, and what are the potential tools that the U.S. and allies could do to avert those futures?
So yeah, there's two kind of options here. We can we're seeing this competition with China and you know, their stated ambitions in this domain. We can either run faster or slow them down. And I think we've counted for a long time on being able to run faster. We've identified some limitations in our system, as well as some national security concerns that we've talked about that make that, you know, potentially not as not the only path that we might want to follow. And so slowing down the competitor then becomes, you know, what's on the menu, and what's potential there. You mentioned sort of the pharmaceutical dependencies. There's also potential agriculture dependencies, energy, you know, everywhere that biology can intersect. You know, us not having control over those sectors or losing out of the ability to apply biotech towards those sectors is a potential weakness, and could lead to more instability in our supply chains and underlying resources. And then, of course, as we've talked about, the potential weaponization of these technologies and tools and the militarization beyond kind of traditional, you know, biological weapons, although, of course, that's something that we keep in mind as well, is why we are, you know, our commission is where we are and why we're oriented in that way. So again, while I don't have formal recommendations for you, some of the things that we're thinking about of how biotech is similar to other technologies, tools that, you know, have been used before may be applied here, and some areas of where it's distinct. You know, some of the semiconductor controls, for example, and AI controls can already be applied to biotech for high performance computing. Biotech relies on compute. We've talked about that before. And so those types of controls may also help, you know, impede the potential weaponization or militarization of the intersection of AI and bio. Some of the unique aspects of biotech that make this a bit more fraught when we start talking about these sorts of protect options is one of the things you highlighted before, the supply chain, right? And it's much more diverse, much more interlinked and complex than what we saw on the semiconductor front. And so controls like export controls, entity listing, you know, all of those become much more complicated. And then there's also the dependency angle, right? We saw, you know, China's retaliation for some of the semiconductor and AI controls of limiting the rare earth elements and the components that they had control over as a response. We've talked about some of the dependencies we have in our pharmaceutical sector with respect to China, although, again, that could be a bit more well-detailed. But it shows that there's a potential leverage for retribution, which we also must be mindful of. So there's some intricacies here that make the protect discussion more complicated, namely the breadth and you know, width of the multiple sectors that this applies to and the multiple players in the space.
Okay. I want to come back to the, or I'll just put this earlier. I think the sort of order of magnitude question is a really interesting one. With the CHIPS Act, you know, like Chuck Schumer started the bidding at 100 million, and it sort of just ended up at 50 because I think that was the size that they thought they could get past. But you at the commission have the intellectual freedom to try to construct some methodologies and hear folks out about defining what goals should be and thinking about the means to get them. I mean, I know we're not at a number yet, but I'm curious what sort of methodologies you guys are thinking about potentially using to understand how much money might be well put to use to promote the broader goals.
Yeah, I think it aligns with the methodology we discussed, which is breaking down the component parts into discrete areas, right? And then looking at what types of, if we're talking about the research stage, how much research is currently being funded, what order of magnitude is that? What are we talking about in terms of new research priorities? And we're also looking at efficient use of spending, right? It might not be simply more money, but we spend a lot of money on biology and life sciences already. We're looking at how that's being spent, and could we look at more efficient uses of those dollars as well.